the last of our webinars building up to publishing of a report that will compile some findings that we have had over the last few months. And in this very webinar, what we are trying to do is to share with you a little bit more about the policy networks cycle and context. Then primarily I have my colleague present some findings and the recommendations that we have come up with and that should really help us to shape the final report. And then we will have a very special guest to provide some both zoomed out and zoomed in reflections, Vint Cerf. So Vint, it's really good to have you here, and quite a serious time of the agenda for today is to have some of your reactions and discussions. So yes, we hope to have this quite interactive. Maybe just a few words in summary of the policy network. If you're not too familiar with that, we are building on a framework that we have developed within the policy network on internet fragmentation, when we are looking at various levels of where fragmentation can be happening, be it on the level of the user, on the kind of technical underlying layer, but as well on the coordination challenges that can arise when it comes to internet governance coordination in general. All of the work that we've been doing over the last, let's say, years or months has also been embedded in some crucial policy processes and developments, mainly, of course, the Global Digital Compact and the WSIS Plus 20 review. So that is the context of the discussion for today. I hope that this is a good plan to go ahead. And at this moment, I would like to hand over to Wim to share with us some first speakings in the draft recommendations.
Thank you, Tereza. Happy to take you through the recommendations. So for those who don't know me, my name is Wim Degezelle. I work as a consultant supporting the work of IGF intersessional activities on behalf of the IGF Secretariat and for the last 3-4 years. Also the policy network on internet fragmentation. So thank you, Tereza, also for, I think it was the previous slide, really pointing out where we have been discussing this topic on internet fragmentation in the last couple of years. Maybe if I can go back to the previous slides, I remember at the beginning of last year, we had with the policy network existential question at the beginning of the year. Is this topic on fragmentation still something relevant? After we have been discussing it for 2 years. And it was, of course, before the GDC was decided. And then once the GDC was decided, we said our work probably makes sense or still makes sense. And we hope the work of the policy network can feed in some additional work with regard to the GDC, WSIS Plus 20. So the policy network had 3 meetings this year where we, again, focused on actually what can the policy network do, also thinking where are the discussions on fragmentation heading. Of course, like I said, we had the GDC commitment, we also had WSIS Plus 20, and one of the questions we asked the panelists at the meeting at the IGF itself and to follow up webinars was actually what is needed to work on fragmentation and to work in the direction of preserving the global and open free internet. I won't take it too long. We have summaries of the meetings online, and we will also reflect what has been discussed at those webinars in our output report that will be published in November. But I want to focus here, and the discussion today is also focused on the draft recommendations we have formulated based on the discussions we had. And not surprisingly, we took from the WSIS formulation or recommendation that came out on what stakeholder cooperation can mean in the context of preserving an open, free, and global internet, and what it can mean in terms of preventing, identifying, and addressing risks of fragmentation. Like I said, we had very interesting discussions at our meetings, and we tried to combine and come up with a very short, I think we have 5 recommendations with the idea that they can be picked up in discussions on the GDC implementation WSIS, but also, and I think most importantly, beyond these 2 events, into a longer term cooperation between stakeholders to avoid fragmentation. I will read out the 5 recommendations we have published. As you saw on the emails, we also have a consultation or a forum open to gain feedback. I think today's meeting is the first really test we have with a real audience where people can say recommendation 1, 2, or 3 is excellent, one has to be changed, or one actually makes no sense. So that is what we really look to get out of this meeting. First recommendation, member states and all stakeholders should ensure that discussions relating to digital sovereignty are inclusive and multi-stakeholder, so that governance of digital technologies is equitable and reflects the need of all stakeholders. The second recommendation, policymakers should work closely with other stakeholders, including the technical community, to understand the impact of their actions and policies on the preservation of the open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure nature of the Internet. Likewise, all stakeholders must acknowledge the legitimate concerns of governments and civil society regarding the protection of Internet users and be open to discuss technical aspects of solutions to address them. The third recommendation, the reaffirmation of the Tunis agenda, including the respective roles of different stakeholders, is important. At the same time, there is an increased need for collaboration and coordination across and within stakeholder groups to ensure the inclusivity of the multi-stakeholder system keeps pace with the evolution of digital development, so that there is a seat at the table for all relevant actors. Fourth, stakeholders should be encouraged to learn from existing examples of effective coordination and collaboration of Internet governance issues that involve multiple entities working across borders. The last one, addressing broader societal issues impacted by the Internet and digital technologies should take place in open, inclusive, and multi-stakeholder settings, for example, via the Internet Governance Forum model. These are the 5 recommendations. As I said, we have a form out to collect the input and feedback, but I would like to hand it over now first to, I think, Sheetal. You will guide us through the remaining. So first, let's focus on the discussion today, and then look forward to further feedback.
Thank you so much, Wim. And we are looking forward to hearing everyone's feedback on those recommendations, which, as you shared through the presentation, are the result of the discussions that have been had in the community via the webinars over the last few months, and which we hope are useful and relevant for the WSIS process, among others. So we're really pleased to have you here, Vint. I'm sure everyone knows who you are. But just by way of introduction, Vint Cerf is the Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, but also the chair of the IGF Leadership Panel and member of the Informal Multi-Stakeholder Sounding Board. Thank you for responding to our invitation to speak today. We're really keen to hear your views on this topic and your feedback on what Wim just presented, in general, your perspectives on the issue, and of course, and whether or not you see the recommendations put forward as constructive or you have any other feedback. So without further ado, over to you, Vint.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate. This topic is of great importance because a fragmented internet tends not to do much good, and we'd like to have a fully connected one. I want to draw attention to Bill Drake, who's on the call, because he and I and others have written on this topic before, and I think our writings are still relevant. There are many different ways in which the internet can be fragmented and interfering with its utility. I'm going to separate this into 2 pieces, the technical fragmentation, and I'll call it application fragmentation for a moment. In the technical fragmentation space, there's a lot of work going on trying to make the system resilient and resistant to various kinds of failure. BGP, for example, DNS, blocking of email and blocking of domain names. These are all internet shutdowns, are sort of the ultimate in internet fragmentation. Denial of service attacks. There's a whole list of technical attacks against the internet that make it less useful and fragment its utility. And a lot of attention is being paid to that by the technical community. There's also a sort of fundamental fragmentation. That's where you don't have access to the internet at all because it isn't there, absent infrastructure, or if it's there, you can't afford it. So there's cost that gets in the way, and there's physical access. And that's only solvable by creating conditions where more internet gets built and is sustainable. The more serious problems, in some sense, are at the application layer, where there are paywalls, for example, and sometimes there's perfectly good business reasons for this, but it is an element of fragmentation. Not everything is freely available. There are non-interoperable applications that create fragmentation. Lots of the social apps, for instance, don't interwork with each other, and that's often deliberate. Email is one of the examples where it isn't. Unfortunately, there's blocking of email because some people send spam. And so you still get fragmentation even in the presence of interoperability. There are accessibility failures of all kinds where the systems are not accessible to people with various disabilities. And that's a hard problem to solve because it's hard to design systems that are universally accessible. But that shouldn't stop us from trying. There are also now increasingly age access controls, and I'm not arguing that's necessarily a bad thing. There's a sensitivity to this because in order to identify your age, you might have to identify yourself. And some people find that unappealing because they think reasonably that you shouldn't have to identify yourself to make use of the internet, except in cases where it's access controlled because you have to subscribe and pay. So they have to know who you are, at least well enough to use your credit card. So there is a meme that has grown over the course of the last decade called digital sovereignty. I find that to be an unfortunate meme because it does interfere with the free flow of traffic in the internet. The reasons for asserting this are countries are saying we don't want our data to flow through this network or that country, or we want to confine information to a geographic territory. That's very appealing for some people who feel that way. Unfortunately, it breaks up the internet. There are other ways of protecting information than isolating it to geophysical constraints, for example, using cryptography as a way of controlling access. So I'm actually unhappy that this data sovereignty idea has grown up and it's being implemented by the cloud providers, including Google, which is where I work. With regard to recommendation number 2, it's very timely and it's very appropriate. I strongly endorse its point because governments are reacting to problems they see, social problems that they see on the internet. I would include in the term social problems, of course, illegal actions and harmful actions that hurt the population. And so governments are responding to that, and we need to help them respond in ways that are effective, but which don't destroy the utility of the internet. And that's a non-trivial challenge that we have to cope with. These are some of the things that I think are impeding our ability to make the internet as useful as it could be. But we understand some of the reasons why these interferences are happening. We need to gather together in a multi-stakeholder way in order to suggest solutions that don't interfere with the utility of the internet. So that's my top level summary. I think all 5 of these recommendations are very useful, but I especially think that number 2 is relevant right now. Our community needs to recognize that governments feel strongly that they have to do something about the harmful effects that they attribute to internet access. We need to help them if they're going to put laws in place that don't destroy the utility of the internet. And we are very much at risk of that happening, I think. So I'll stop there, and I welcome other comments on this question of fragmentation.
Great, thanks, Vint. It's great to hear your specific feedback on the recommendations and also the strong support for the second one. I think it was a theme that came through the 3 webinars the most strongly, perhaps, regarding the need to create more collaborative listening solutions and tie communities together more on some of the issues arising collectively, affecting society that may not have technical solutions or include technical solutions, but require a more whole of society approach and include that engagement from the technical community. So really great to hear your support for that and also your feedback on the others. We'll now turn to everyone else on the call for feedback. What we thought would be one way of doing it. Bruna and I discussed this earlier today, and it's an idea. We hope it works because we really, as we said, took some time to listen to what was coming through the webinars and put these together, but really want to hear, obviously, everyone's feedback on what Wim presented earlier. In order to do that, we thought going through each one by one, and opening up the room, it could be really useful. Therefore, we want to either allow you to do that by taking the floor, or we'll be looking at the chat, but just want to make sure there's time for everyone to respond to each. Before we do that, though, as we have you here, Vint, and you've said you do have to drop off at the hour, is there anyone who would like to ask Vint a question before we go into the recommendations or react to anything that's been said?
That sort of implies that I have answers. I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I'd like to encourage Bill Drake to jump in here because I know he's thought a lot about these problems. And I notice he's now unmuted. So, Bill, maybe you could jump in.
Okay. Thanks, Vint. I didn't have a comment walking through each one. I have a broader connected comment. Obviously, I think that these are all fine recommendations. They're all process recommendations. They're things we could say about almost any topic in internet governance, about how it'd be good to conduct things in a more inclusive and open way and so on. So, of course, it's easy to support them. It's harder, of course, to come up with more targeted, substantive comments. I think, for example, the whole point about digital sovereignty that Vint was making is one where some of us have had a lot of debate with various colleagues around the world around this construct for a long time, which has not really gone anywhere productive. Ultimately, there's such a desire among stakeholders and governments somewhere to do something, has been said, to assert some sort of more control against globalized flows, etc., that the idea of territorializing data seems to appeal across political divides. So you got European social democrats and Chinese authoritarians both making effectively the same argument. And I find myself, I don't know how to engage with that sometimes, which is frustrating as a international relations scholar who's worked on sovereignty in international communications for 40 years. But I wanted to make a different point, though. We had a consultation for the WSIS Plus 20 review for stakeholders. And I made a comment that I actually just copied. I had to, because I never write out my comments. I always just talk, and then I get the AI summary and then write it up. So I just got the summary of what I said yesterday. I'm going to put it into the chat because I think it's relevant to this group. I'm not suggesting it as something that the group would necessarily want to adopt as language, but I think it speaks to what you're doing here. So let me just put it. So the WSIS, if you look at this posted now on the website of DESA, the zero draft has several mentions of fragmentation and says, oh, fragmentation is bad, we should all cooperate. But it doesn't say anything specifically about what that means. So I thought, why not make a suggestion, concrete suggestion? So I suggested a tweak to one of the paragraphs saying, we affirm the need to promote focused and sustained international dialogue among governments and stakeholders in the IGF and other appropriate international venues in order to help identify and mitigate the risk of internet fragmentation. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, rather than having, I doubt that the governments will agree to my language because, first of all, none of them, I think, bother to even read what's said in the stakeholder consultations. So things that we input into the process, this is completely unlike WSIS 20 years ago. We're basically talking to ourselves. But I do think it would have been better if the WSIS outcome document were to say something concrete about where dialogue should occur, and that the dialogue should include governments in a substantial way and should be focused and sustained, rather than just like a one-off thing. It doesn't do that much good to have a main session or a couple of workshops at a given IGF about fragmentation and we all talk to each other and then everybody goes home. If you want to actually progress this issue, I think it'd be useful to actually try and encourage the parties to address the issue, because they keep making statements about fragmentation is bad, but there's absolutely no activity of any real nature out there where governments are talking to each other and stakeholders too, including key stakeholders like Google and others, around what is fragmentation and should we do anything about it. So I just wanted to put it on the table. I think that's an idea that to try to make this more concrete. Anyway, I'll stop rambling. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Bill. I knew calling on you would be a good thing. Let me suggest that the wording could be modified slightly. At the end there, you say mitigate the risks of internet fragmentation. I would actually make it more strong. I would say mitigate the harms of internet fragmentation. We need to emphasize why the internet has been as successful as it has is because of the free flow of information and access to information virtually on a global scale. The ability to conduct commerce on a global scale is a function of being able to move data from one place to another freely. We can also understand that parties would like to control access to information, and we all understand that, but then there are mechanisms for doing that are more sophisticated than trying to block the flow of information. I mentioned encryption in my overview remarks. Those are actually much more powerful tools for controlling where information goes or where it's accessible. I like very much your idea of being more concrete about dealing with the side effects of internet fragmentation and try to encourage governments to recognize that it's in their best interest for information to flow freely. I suppose this gets into the same arguments about low tariffs and free flow of goods and services, which at the moment is not high on some people's agenda. In fact, if anything, it's just the opposite. And of course, it's interfering with the global economy. But I'm glad that you made that intervention because it would be a useful suggestion for that document to contain something like what you wrote.
Thanks, Vint, and thanks, Bill, as well. We've taken note of that, and there's been some engagement in the chat as well, reacting to what you've said and suggesting that the recommendations are more concrete, focused, or explain the rationale behind them. To that end, perhaps on the first one, I can say that the reason why we included that recommendation arising from the webinars was that there was a discussion of how digital sovereignty narratives are impacting internet fragmentation. And there was a suggestion that instead of shying away from those discussions or pushing back against them fully, there should be a means of encouraging inclusive and bottom-up discussions that relate to them to ensure that the processes themselves are inclusive of all stakeholders. So that was where that came from, with an effort to try and understand the different regions and contexts and rationales behind which digital sovereignty narratives were founded on. That's the rationale. There was a comment in the chat about the usefulness of perhaps explaining why the recommendations are what they are or expanding on them. And Bill, you offered something interesting there as well, or providing more examples. So I'm open to looking at the chat. Okay, we've got Bruna and Arja on the list. So we can go to you first, Bruna, and especially if you have any comments on the recommendation one, which we seem to be looking at in some detail. We'd be keen to hear from everyone on that.
Yes, thanks, Chantal. And thanks everyone for the interventions, Vint and Bill as well. I think just maybe going over a little more into the sovereignty discussions, I can understand to some extent that the conversations on sovereignty can be enabling for some countries to take more control over the flux of communications or to attempt to intervene over freedom of expression and so on. But at the same time, coming from a global majority country, I do believe that over the evolution of digital businesses and digital corporations or any companies that exist in this space, there has been a long-term need for a more responsible and more careful behavior emerging from these actors, namely the private sector, but not just the private sector, the biggest companies in that sense. And also in terms of how they can tend to comply with certain regulations and tend to avoid or recuse themselves from addressing harms in different parts of the world. I don't think it's fair to say that, for instance, some of those companies address digital harms in Europe the same way they address digital harms in India or other parts of Southeastern Asia or anything like that. So I do think that's where this stronger call for sovereignty comes, because it does build on the fact that some populations, some communities, they feel that they were overlooked by corporations above all, that their rights were overlooked, and there's not enough tools for ensuring rights, safeguarding users in that sense. And I just wanted to give a little bit of background in that, because Again, as much as I understand that sovereignty conversation can be an enabler for abuse, I also don't think that we're in a stage where the internet is so open to the point that we don't have people excluded from it, whether it's connectivity or how queer or female activists don't feel safe enough to speak online. We still have a serious amount of exclusion, and that might be, in the end of the day, an enabler of those arguments. But again, I'm not working on these topics, but just some initial thoughts based on the discussions on Brazil, which are the ones that I closely follow. That's that. Thanks, Chantal.
Thanks to you, Bruna, for explaining that one a bit more. Also, I just responded in the chat about your comment on perhaps how we could make the need for engagement, or not engagement, but rather what the impacts of decisions and actions clearer, and the need to really center that. That definitely came through, but we can try and emphasize that more clearly in the recommendations. All right, over to you, Arja. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You can also introduce yourself. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks. So I work for GIZ, which is the German International Development Cooperation. And we also work with the UN IGF Secretariat, and also are funding some regional activities, and also have been looking into the policy networks as a potentially interesting way to bring some of our partners from different regions into global internet governance discussions. So this is actually my first time in this discussion round, but I'm seeing the recommendations, and I would not be able to tell the recommendations apart very much from another topic within internet governance. For me, it really does lack kind of a concrete reference to internet fragmentation and harms of internet fragmentation, what specifically is meant with internet fragmentation. And also, let's say if we are thinking about bringing in partners from regional and national levels to this conversation, I just feel like these recommendations are still very broad, but maybe this is the level at which they are intended to be. But I guess I just feel like these recommendations are applicable to a lot of other areas of internet governance as well. So I don't really see how these are specific and concrete enough to really maybe be a challenging and forward-looking process and step forward. But maybe I don't understand exactly where we are or where this network is in that process as well. I guess that's my reflection for now. Yeah, thanks.
No, that's great. Thank you, Arja. And thank you for the feedback on how they could be improved by being more specific and concrete, perhaps. We have, as I said, reviewed what came through the webinars. And so this was essentially what was agreed upon. It's still very high level, but perhaps I'm keen to hear from others on the call. One way that they could be made more concrete and specific is through examples or ideas for discussion. That is something that with the call, here we are now, but also with the 2-week period that we have to provide feedback on the recommendations, we could really try and recommend or suggest that people provide examples or expand on their understanding of the recommendation, and then we can, in that way, add more detail to them. We wanted to be accurate in the way that we were distilling what was coming through the discussions. Okay, we have Omor, and do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share my reflections. So I'm Omor Faruque, a 19-year-old young stakeholder from Bangladesh, founder and president of Project OMNA. I'm also working with PNMA and PNAI, and also contributing to UN's other initiatives like the Global Digital Compact and WICES Plus 20. So as one of the youngest voices in global digital spaces, I want to highlight an often overlooked dimension of internet fragmentation. I mean, its physical, psychological, and generational impact. So when young people grow up in a digital divided environment shaped by shutdowns, firewalls, and fragmented networks, it doesn't just restrict access to information. It fragments minds, opportunities, and trust in digital world. Internet fragmentation risks creating a generation of digitally disconnected citizens, not by lack of technology, but by the design of exclusion. So that's why I recommend 3 things. Firstly, include mental and social well-being as consideration in assessing the human impact of internet fragmentation, especially on young users whose identity and learning are deeply digital. Secondly, integrate youth expertise in cross-border coordination efforts, ensuring that digital policies protect not just systems, but the aspirations of future generations who will inherit them. And lastly, embed digital empathy and literacy frameworks into internet governance dialogues so that as we preserve the open internet technically, we also preserve its spirit of connection, creativity, and care. As Mr. Cerf reminded us, isolation is the true enemy of an open internet, but isolation isn't only structural, it's emotional and generational too. Let's make sure our next internet is one of that healed divisions, both online and within ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think, yes, including the voices of youth, as you said, is so important. If you have any comments on any of the specific recommendations or how we can reinforce that message in the recommendations, please do feel free to share that. So I'm just looking at the chat and I can see, Vint, that you've added some more concrete recommendations or examples under the recommendations. Any other comments or anyone want to take the floor on any of the recommendations? Perhaps you can speak more broadly, or if you have any specific comments that could be examples of how the recommendation could be understood. That could be very helpful at this stage. I'm just hearing that it would be useful to get more specificity through these recommendations.
I'm just going to suggest that the idea of putting examples into the recommendations, not necessarily saying you should do this particular thing, but to say, here's an example of the kind of thing that this recommendation is trying to get at. That helps people formulate a better model of what we're trying to suggest by giving examples, not necessarily saying you should do this one, but to say things like this would make a difference. I tried to say that in the chat, for example, with regard to BGP, that requires technical protections in order to avoid certain kinds of interference and fragmentation. I see Bruna has her hand up, so we should go there.
Thank you so much. I actually put some recommendations that came from the last webinar where the recommendation really drew from in the chat, just to give a sense of perhaps others that people here may think of could be useful for illustrative purposes, like you said, Vint. And thank you for sharing the ones that you shared in the chat. We've taken note of those. Bruna, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, very briefly, I think Vint and I are going towards the same place in that idea of the examples and so on. I think I was looking at recommendation 5 about the broader societal issues impacted by the internet and digital technologies. And I was like, while looking at it, I also think that's the one that could serve as a better umbrella for all of those discussions around digital rights, addressing power imbalances, new colonial structures of power, and a lot of the debate on how to tackle harms online. So perhaps bringing some examples here, or even like a subline to this recommendation, could be a meaningful effort in that sense. Yeah, but that was the only thought that I had in my mind as well. And if folks also feel like doing additions to this, feel free. We have a lot of folks in the room with different levels of experiences, and not just the technical space, but also part of civil society and government. And it would be lovely to hear from you as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Bruna. I think those are some useful ideas for the broader societal issues that we could explain further or provide as examples under recommendation 5. You said tackling harms online. That's come through a lot, that there's efforts to do that. These are broader societal issues, and the recommendation is that they should take place in open, inclusive, and multi-stakeholder settings. I just want to note as well that there was a suggestion earlier, I think it was Flavio, who said that perhaps they could be streamlined as well. There are connections between the recommendations. So recommendation 5, there's also this relation to the fact that while there may be broader solutions to legitimate concerns of governments and civil society, there is a need to discuss technical aspects, although technical aspects may only be one aspect of the issues. So clearly a need for expansion on these. Peter, you said regarding this too, this only makes sense if we explicitly acknowledge that Rec 4 does not mention multi-stakeholder. Okay, I don't know if you want to speak to that, because I don't know if I've fully, perhaps would you recommend it being reworded. Recommendation 4 does not include multi-stakeholder. It could include reference to multi-stakeholder. Any other thoughts on that one? Or any others? So this one is stakeholders should be encouraged. Sorry, I'll just put recommendation 4 in the chat so everyone can see what we're talking about. This is it. Okay, anyone want to react to that? Or I don't want to put you on the spot, Peter. I just want to make sure we understood what you offered there. Also look through the rest of the chat.
I do have my hand up, though.
Oh, you do? Sorry. Over to you.
No worries. Sometimes you can't see that. Okay, so this is Peter from DNIC. I need to apologize. So obviously that, not so obviously, that remark was a bit of sarcastic because I haven't followed the previous webinar, so I don't know in what context NIS2, which is clearly the work of governments and is an interesting example of lack of multi-stakeholder consultation. Even more so if we look at and not bothering everybody with European politics, but if you go down into the implementation, the further the regulation goes towards the wire, the less consultation and involvement of the affected parties is going to happen. So citing NIS2 as an example of successful, and that was maybe my misunderstanding, of a successful application of recommendation 4 would really confuse me. That was what I was trying to say, and apologies for the sarcastic approach here.
I'm meant to be British, so I should really be understanding that. These are not set in stone. We just wanted to put some food for thought in there. So that's great to hear your reaction to that, Peter. The other ones were also brought up in the last webinar as examples of coordination across borders on issues requiring that, where there was what was seen as an effective outcome in terms of maintaining an open, secure, interoperable internet. Definitely just ideas, and keen to hear from others on them. It would be interesting for us perhaps to, when we reach out to community for more feedback on the recommendations, encourage people to share their understanding or what they think might be good examples. And then we can make sure that the examples or the ideas shared are understood to simply be not set in stone or objective by any means. But yes, great to get your feedback on that one in particular. Are there any other feedback from anyone on the recommendations or any broader points? Or any questions about process? Okay, so I see someone has put something in the chat. Okay, so explain the social division of the UN, etc. Okay, so we've noted what's in the chat. Thank you for all of that. And there isn't time to go through each recommendation one by one, but over the course of the last hour, we've certainly had feedback on them collectively or some more specific feedback on some of them. There seemed to be a lot of support for recommendation 2, suggestions as well that there may need to be streamlining, suggestions that they could be made more concrete, perhaps through examples and more actionable. And Bruna, is there anything you think we can do in the remaining time to solicit feedback at this point?
Thanks. And I was also just following the chat as well, and also Flavio's suggestion of merging recommendations 3 and 4, which I think can also be relevant in that sense. Maybe we could dive into a debate about next steps or even the implementation of these recommendations. Like if folks had ideas or thoughts on whether any of them should address any specific stakeholder, or if there is anything missing in terms of addressing specific stakeholders, and also just in terms about how to use them and so on. So it's more a question of where, who, and how, but reopening the floor as well if folks have any thoughts or ideas about where to kickstart this debate. Like, I think Peter, you highlighted very well that if we are driving them towards like some of the policy processes, it can be indeed a bit difficult to have them being fully applicable because a lot of those policy processes, they have their own flaws. In a lot of them, the multi-stakeholder principle is not really followed. And even in the example Bill was giving earlier, right? It's like we have currently the consultation/negotiations around the WSIS plus 20 resolution. And even in this process where everyone is advocating for multi-stakeholder inclusion, we have a closed off discussion between member states. It's not very transparent and everyone is trying their best in following the conversation. So yeah, maybe I'll stop speaking now. And if folks have any thoughts about the where, who, and how, you're more than welcome to share them with us either right now or through the form later on.
Thanks, Bruna. Stefan asked in the chat, couldn't free flow of information be a human right? Certainly, I think that's a good point. That is perhaps central to that question of being able to exercise human rights through and via the internet is an indispensable tool, an unfragmented internet. So there are different ways of ensuring that right is meaningfully able to be exercised. And perhaps that's also a comment or an example that could be added to one of the recommendations. Just looking again at the chat in case there's anything else. Yeah, Article 19 implies that, you say, Bill. In terms of next steps, perhaps it would be good to get your view. We do have a couple of, and I know that Vint, you have to go soon. I just want to say thank you again for being here and for all of your feedback, which we have taken on board. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So in terms of next steps, keen to hear what you think. Our idea was to, through a forum, collect feedback. We can perhaps amend the form so that it really specifically asks for examples. And then we can make sure that examples are included in a way that doesn't say that everyone has agreed that these are the best examples, but rather that these ideas have come through a consultation. And then we could streamline perhaps a couple of them as well as per recommendations that have come through on this webinar and suggest that they be discussed further. Of course, we are open to your feedback on what to do next. Anyone want to share any further thoughts?
It's Vint. I'll just add one thing before I have to jump off, and that's the idea of making a recommendation and then including within the recommendation examples that you don't necessarily assert should be done, but they are examples of things that could be considered. I think that will help people ingest the recommendations with a clearer understanding of what we're trying to say. So I think it's safe to incorporate these examples, but by being careful to say we're not recommending that particular example, we just want to use it as an example of a concrete step that could be taken in order to undertake that recommendation. I need to jump, but thanks very much for letting me join you today. It was a good discussion, I think.
Thank you, Vint. Stay tuned and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Wim, you've asked in the chat, how can the RECs be of use in light of the GDC commitment? Yes, that's a question, open question to everyone here. Are you suggesting we also include that on the forum?
It's not necessarily on the forum. It's just a way of thinking. It's based on what Peter asked earlier in the chat. Where will they be published? It can also, if one thinks that these recommendations are really applicable or can be useful, it doesn't harm to explicitly mention it when we send it out, or explicitly point at that commitment and then say that if you think about stakeholder cooperation, these are recommendations that can help you there.
Absolutely. Okay. That's the connection. Hopefully that's clear. So really the GDC commitment was at the heart of the framework for the webinars when we put it together. And now we've come, of course, this is the WSIS plus 20 review crunch time. And we wanted to be able to support that. I think the fragmentation recommendation commitment in the GDC still, of course, like you say, remains front and center. So We can make that clearer with the outreach, perhaps. And just to say again, and Vint was giving a kind of strong signal there, I think, before he left, that more illustrative information could be sought for the recommendations and then added to them, with the caveat that they're not examples endorsed by everybody or gone through a process, but rather that they have been drawn from a consultation process. And that could help concretize, perhaps. And then we can also perhaps suggest that others also add more concrete information on how they understand the recommendation in the outreach, which will be done by the form. But also everyone can contribute by email as well, right? So there will be different ways to contribute over the next couple of weeks on the recommendations. And I also want to say thank you for everyone's feedback and general support for them. Of course, we got that feedback as well, that they could be more useful if they're more specific. So hopefully the examples will help with that. Any other comments? Bruna, Wim, Tereza, I don't want to. And Arja, what is the expected outcome of the recommendations post-November? So the final output will be the report with the recommendations, and hopefully we'll get a lot more feedback on them, examples, and more concrete information. And that will all be put together in the report. But Wim, can you please respond on that, just in case I got that wrong? Is that right?
That's exactly correct. So the report is going to be published as output of this year. But hence, therefore, it's also relevant to ask the question if there are any recommendations on what we can do with the outcome, where to push it, or where that could be really helpful for us. But in general, this becomes part of the Policy Network output report.
So there's another question about, thank you for that, Wim, for clarifying. And as with any outputs, they can be then further built on, like you say, by stakeholders and used as a jumping off board for even more detailed discussions, because they are the result of this inclusive discussion, hopefully. When you ask, the Policy Network agenda will be determined after the report is published. As far as I understand, and I'm going to come to Bruna for you, of course, on this as well, there is still the WSIS plus 20 process to be concluded, and then there'll be more clarity on the IGF and its form, etc. So I don't know if we can say anything yet about what happens after the report. But there will be a report. It will include what's happened. It will include the recommendations. And I hope those recommendations will be strengthened by the input over the next couple of weeks that we'll get. Bruna, over to you.
Thanks. No, just to say that there is also, right, Wim, the intersessional events at the end of the semester, where a lot of the different intersessional efforts of intersessional work around the IGF will be hopefully presenting their outcomes and a lot of the discussions across the year. So not just this PN, but also the PNMA, PNAI, DPPF that's currently running on internet and humanitarian crisis, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of these discussions will all come to the same place, and hopefully folks will have a chance of exploring this, which is always good because it can generate a lot of ideas for next year, and also ideas about how the intersessional work will follow. It's a bit difficult to say what's going to happen next year right now, because we're still in the process of the negotiation of the WSIS plus 20 resolution that will hopefully renew the IGF mandate. And once the resolution is published, then we still need to figure out who's going to be the next MAG chair, how we're going to follow through this work, and the convocation for the new MAG. So there's a lot of steps in this sense, but hopefully at the beginning of next year, there will be a new discussion on new modalities or new subjects for intersessional work. And if folks feel that there is still something to explore on the fragmentation side, that could be a possible proposal for next year, or if not, it can be merged into some other incoming intersessional work. So just taking some time to explain a little bit of that. Thanks, Chantal.
Thank you so much. I think we are coming to the end then. The last hour really got so much feedback that will inform the next stage. And there's going to be 2 more weeks for everyone to input on the form. We'll, I think, be able to try and make sure that those responses relate to examples or expanding on your understanding of the recommendations, so that we can provide more concrete recommendations in the report. It's been, great to hear everyone's feedback. Thank you so much for coming. And please do share the forum widely, or rather the opportunity to input, and continue to add your thoughts to the recommendations. We really appreciate that.
And also thanks for the engagement across the year, right? It's the last one for us. So thanks a lot to everyone that engaged with us and helped on the PNIF.
Yes, thank you so much. And of course, the work isn't yet done, so stay tuned and stay engaged and reach out to us if you have any questions. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Have a great day.